Yo, what's up guys, Alf here, and today I'm going to be doing a historic set review for the Arena Powered Cube bonus sheet cards that we're going to get added very soon, which I'm really excited about. So, if you hadn't seen, Wizards recently announced this new Arena Powered Cube, which I'm really excited about. So, as you can tell from the content on my channel, I'm not really a big limited player. There are some formats that I've enjoyed playing in the past, but for the most part, I really love deck building and I'm much more of a constructed player. However, the exception for that is Cube. I absolutely love playing Cube. So, if this, if you want to see limited content on the channel, if you'd be interested in seeing Cube videos, definitely let me know in the comments. But on the flip side, if you're someone who just likes constructed and that's not something you'd watch, also let me know. It'd be interesting to kind of gauge people's opinions, what sort of stuff they'd be interested in. So if you haven't seen this, they're basically going to be adding a new Cube format to Arena on October 28th. And alongside that, they're going to be releasing a bonus sheet, kind of similar that they do with the regular sets, with a bunch of new to Arena cards that are going to become legal in both Historic and Timeless, which is really exciting. And by the sounds of it, they're going to be sort of rotating this bonus sheet, if that makes sense, so that we'll be getting more, different cards added in future, which I think is a great way to add some, powerful cards to Arena alongside the anthologies. Very, very excited about that. However, I have one very big issue with this. Now, again, Wizards haven't confirmed whether this is going to be legal when the Cube does launch, right? I've said October the 28th. That's the date they've given. However, if this does get added on October the 28th, it means these cards are going to be legal for the Historic Qualifier. But not only that, they're only going to be legal 4 days before the Qualifier actually takes place, which is kind of madness to me. And not only that, but it's going to be, 3 of those 4 days are weekdays as well. Now, that's not personally an issue for me because I'm sure I can find time during those 4 days to test. But I imagine a lot of people, including a lot of people maybe watching this video, who've been testing for this qualifier for weeks or maybe months, but have a busy work week or school week during that week and just literally won't have any time to playtest these cards at all. I don't mind Wizards shaking up the format relatively close to a qualifier. That's kind of the reason why I made the video about pushing for an Eldrazi Temple ban potentially, but I think you need to be doing that at least a couple of weeks out, right? 2 or 3 weeks at least gives people enough time to, test the format, figure out what's good, and still get a bit of a competitive advantage because the metagame might not get, a chance to fully settle, so you do get a competitive edge if you find something first before other people. But 4 days seems a bit crazy to me. Now, as I'll go through these cards, I don't think they're going to have a massive impact in the format really, but if they do, a lot of people are just going to have no time to test whatsoever. And while I'm complaining as well, I just want to quickly get something else out as well. This qualifier weekend is so weird. So the qualifier is obviously in November, but it's the 1st and 2nd. But because it's so early in the month, it means that the play-in events are going to happen before the ladder qualification, which is also kind of crazy to me. So basically, usually what happens is you'll have the ladder season end, so if you're top 250 you don't have to worry about the play-ins, but you've got kind of play-ins as a backup, then you can play the best of 1 or the best of 3 1. Because this qualifier is so early in November, it means the best of 1 play-in is going to be this weekend, 25th, and then the best of 3 play-in is going to be happening the same day as the ladder qualification. So that means if you don't want to play best of 1, which I think is a perfectly acceptable stance to take, I imagine a lot of people who view my channel, my channel is almost all best of 3 content, and most people who play best of 3 don't like best of 1, especially in Historic, because it's such a different format. It's so much less interactive, less player agency, more variance. But it means if you don't play best of 1 and you don't play in this play-in qualifier, your opportunity to qualify, you're not going to know until the day before the qualifier if you're qualified, if you just play best of 3, because your 2 options are top 250 qualification for the October season when the qualifier is the next day, or the best of 3 play-in, which again is the day before. So if you're someone who plays ladder and then plays the best of 3, if you don't make top 250, you don't have that opportunity. You have to pick one or the other, and that's going to lead to some, I don't know, pretty feel bad if you've been testing for this qualifier for weeks or months and then you don't make top 250, or you just happen to get unlucky in the best of 3 play-ins and you don't get there, because having only 1 day to figure out if you've made it for best of 3 is going to be a nightmare. So I'm probably going to be grinding the best of 1 event for that reason. I don't love playing best of 1 because of the reasons I've said. I think it's a much more high variance format, but I really hope Wizards don't do this again where the qualifier is so early in the month that the best of 3 players literally won't know if they're qualified to do it until the very last minute, if that makes sense. But anyway, that's kind of separate to what this video is about. This video is much more about these new cards and talking about what I think of them. Going to zoom in a little bit so we can see the cards a little bit more clearly, but Yeah, there are some that are going to be pre-banned, which makes sense because there are some, free spells in here. We got Fire Blast, which I can understand. Preordain, I mean, I've seen a few people talk about this, they've just allowed Ponder in, why don't they allow Preordain? I think this makes sense. They obviously just don't want us to have both. In Modern, obviously Preordain is legal and Ponder isn't, so I think it makes sense to not have two of the best cantrips of all time available in the format, because then I think decks like, Lotus Field probably has just too much consistency. Decks like Wizards and just any deck that uses cantrips is going to become too powerful with both of them in the format. Pyrokinesis, again, sort of a free spell, and then Seething Song, I guess they don't want Storm combo to be legal, which makes sense. The one I'm a little bit confused they've left out, though, is they've left Snuff Out legal, which, to be honest, out of all the free spells they could leave in, I don't mind it being a piece of interaction like this, because I do feel like a big problem with Historic in general for years at this point has been that the threats are really powerful and the interaction just isn't good enough. So I don't mind very conditional free spells if they're interaction in the format, because I do feel like Historic is lacking good quality interaction, so I don't mind that. But anyway, I'm just going to go through all the cards here, tell you what I think of them, where they could potentially fit, whether I think they're playable or not for a start, because at the end of the day, these are cube cards, and a lot of the time cube doesn't really translate specifically to constructed formats. So let's just get straight into it, starting off here with Carnage Interpreter, which I don't think we'll see any play at all. I think the main reason you would want this sort of card is to go alongside a card like Archway of Innovation, or I guess, potentially if you want to get a bunch of artifacts into play really quickly. But I think if you're running Archway of Innovation, you're much more likely to be running Tamiyo Meets the Story Circle. I think at 3 mana, this is just too slow for that sort of effect anyway. So if there's something I've missed, definitely let me know in the comments, but I really don't see this one seeing play at all. Same sort of thing with Coalition Relic. I think 3 mana rocks have to be exceptionally good to see play at all when we have a variety of really good 2 mana options, especially with the talismans that we got added recently. So I very much doubt this one will see play either. And then next up we got Dack Fayden, which is obviously a very iconic card. 3 mana Planeswalkers, I mean, they are powerful, but I just don't really see a good home for this in Historic right now. I think for Dack Fayden to be good, the -2 mode needs to be consistently good, and I just don't think there are good enough, consistently played artifacts in the format right now. I think if you wanted to target Affinity, the main artifact you'd want to steal is Kappa Cannoneer, which has Ward 4. So, cool card. I'm very happy it's being added to the format, because I do think this is one that could be good in the future. But right now, I don't really see it being good without the -2 mode being good, if that makes sense. The next up, we got Death Greeter's Champion. Again, I don't really see this one seeing much play. I just think it's too slow. I don't think there's really a good home for it either. So, top 4 are kind of duds in my opinion. Dack Fayden could be good in future, but not 100% sure on that one. Dress Down, though, is one that I do think could potentially see play. But again, I'm not sure it has great homes in the current metagame. Typically, from what I understand, Dress Down is mainly played in sort of conventional control decks, blue-white control and stuff like that, which haven't really been viable in Historic for a really long time anyway, and I very much doubt we'll see much play at all in the current Eldrazi meta. I do think that this could potentially see play, maybe in the sideboard of a deck like Is It Wizards, because I think in the current metagame, the main deck that gets hosed the most by Dress Down is probably the Jund Goyfs deck, because this will obviously shrink all their Goyfs down to 0/1s for the most part, and in a deck like Is It Wizards that's relying on red damage base removal, that could be a matchup where their creatures outscale your damage fairly quickly, in which case you could obviously Dress Down, put them all to 0/1s and then block in combat, or kill them with burn spells. But even then, you could probably just run a blue bounce spell instead and get the same sort of effect without needing to have Dress Down plus a burn spell, if that makes sense. So I definitely think Dress Down is a card that is likely to see play in future, especially if we get more creatures like Death Shadow where it can be used proactively as well. But right now in the current metagame, the only real home I could think of right now is a deck relying on red damage base removal against a Goyf deck where you can shrink them. But again, I don't really think the Jund Goyfs deck is going to be particularly well positioned. I've been playing quite a lot with it recently, and it is powerful, but I just haven't been able to get the Eldrazi matchup to a consistently good point. So I'm not sure it's really worth dedicating slots for that in Is It Wizards, for example. And like I said, you could easily run stuff like Into the Floodmoor, which is much more consistent at what it's trying to do. So probably one for the future. I'm not sure this has much use in the current metagame, at least. Then Figure of Destiny, another pretty iconic threat. It is a cool card, but again, I think it's a little bit too slow, and again, I don't think it has a great home right now either. I think we have a ton of better 1-drops in these colours anyway, so cool card, but again, I'm not really sure it has a great home right now. Fire Blast, obviously banned, we've looked at that one already. Glimmer Lens is kind of an interesting one, but again, it seems a little bit too slow for me, and again, doesn't really have a great home, so kind of the main talking point for a lot of these cards that are cool in Cube, but probably just don't really slot anywhere in Historic right now. Leovold, though, is a card that I do think could see play in this sideboard, specifically if decks running Green Sun Zenith and Chord of Calling, because, you know, the main two decks that I've been testing recently with those two cards have been Val Combo and Yawgmoth, and in both of those decks I have struggled to find a consistently good sideboard card against Lotus Field. Obviously there are options like Damping Sphere and stuff like that, but it's an issue dedicating so many sideboard cards to a very narrow effect like this, whereas Leovold, if you are already running Zenith and Chord of Calling, you can just run it as a one-off tutor target, bring it in against Lotus Field, tutor it up, and then you just basically hose their entire deck. They basically have to remove this before they can do anything, really. And you could also bring it in against Affinity, because it does stop Drix Interlacer, Thoughtcast, Thought Monitor as well. So if you're running a deck with Green Sun Zenith and or Chord of Calling, I would definitely consider running this as a one-off, even if your deck's not in Sultai colours, because, you know, if you do look at Val and Yawgmoth, you often are running Starting Town and Mana Confluence in those decks, which can both cast it. Both of those decks often also run Prosperous Innkeeper, which produces a treasure that can cast it as well. So on the off chance that you do draw it, you do still have some ways to cast it in those sorts of decks. But for the most part, it's just going to be in your deck, and then you can tutor it up against, like I said, Lotus Field Combo or Affinity, and then it poses a real problem, and you only have to dedicate one sideboard slot for the matchup, if that makes sense. The next up we got Mind Collapse, which is another kind of free spell, free piece of interaction, which, like I've said, I think if they are going to allow free spells in the format, just interaction is the best way to do it, because I do think there's definitely a disparity between the threats and the interaction in Historic right now. Out of the two, I definitely think that Snuff Out is better, because the cost of having to sacrifice a mountain rather than just have one in play is a pretty big deal. It's a pretty big difference. Now, having said that, obviously free pieces of interaction are very, very powerful, and obviously, one of the big issues in Historic is that we don't have actual fetch lands, so having a mountain in play isn't a given, especially in two-colour decks, because outside of the Shock lands and Prismatic Vista, the majority of good dual lands in Historic aren't, you know, the basic land type. So you are going to have to make some tweaks in your mana base maybe to consistently be able to use this, but I do think that, you know, in my opinion, Mind Collapse is quite a bit worse than Snuff Out because you have to sacrifice the mountain. So in decks that could run it, you know, is it Wizards, Boros Energy, stuff like that, I think they've already got decent enough interaction where they don't necessarily need this, mainly because the opportunity cost of sacrificing a land is a pretty high cost, especially if you have to use it early in the game, right? The difference between using this and, you know, say a Ribald Shanty or, you know, an early burn spell in a deck like Is It Wizards, or, you know, maybe a Fragment Reality or Prismatic Ending from Boros Energy, is that you want your interaction to be able to be used in the early game, especially against decks like, you know, Boros Auras, for example, and having to sacrifice a mountain on turn 2 to kill a Core Spirit Dancer seems really bad. So I'm not sure this is going to see play currently, but definitely one to bear in mind going forward, because obviously free interaction is very powerful. The next up we got Myr Battlesphere, which is quite an iconic card, and the first thing that springs to mind is another card that is in principle to Ugin's Labyrinth, but the only real Labyrinth deck right now is Eldrazi, and I think, you know, while Eldrazi Temple's in the format, there's no real reason to run this over the 7-drop Eldrazi. Not to mention, I think the majority of 7-drop Eldrazi is just better than this. So this seems like more of just a cube card to me. I'd be surprised if it does actually see top-tier constructed play in Historic, but I've not played with this card, so maybe I'm missing something. Let me know in the comments if I am. The next time we got Preordain, which, you know, I kind of talked about this already. They obviously don't want us to have both Ponder and Preordain in the format, which makes total sense to me, so no issue with them pre-banning that. Pentad Prism is kind of an interesting one. I don't think this really has a great home right now. You know, whilst Eldrazi Temple is legal, I think running any other ramp shell just doesn't really make sense because of the speed and consistency of that deck. But if they do, you know, eventually ban Eldrazi Temple, probably on the 10th of November, because that's when the next BNR is, although I know they do Historic with the digital ones, so maybe not then. But if they do end up banning Eldrazi Temple, then this is a pretty interesting option, because it is a 2-mana piece of acceleration that can, you know, ramp us by 2 mana, so you can very consistently have 5 mana on turn 3. So if there is a deck that is trying to ramp into a 5-drop, this seems like a really good choice there, if you can consistently get Sunburst on it, to be able to consistently cast it on turn 3. But like I said, right now, whilst Eldrazi Temple is legal, I think it just doesn't really make sense to run any other ramp shell, because it's just so much more, you know, consistent and resilient than any other ramp shell we've got at the moment. Then Pyrokinesis and Seething Song, both pre-banned. We've already kind of talked about them already. Then Snuff Out. I think this is the biggest one for me. I think this is the one that's likely to have the biggest impact, because, you know, like I said, I think it's just better than, where is it, Mind Collapse, because you don't have to sacrifice a mountain, you just have to have a swamp in play. And like I said, it is kind of tricky to consistently have a swamp in Historic, because a lot of the lands are, what am I saying? They're, you know, a lot of the good dual lands aren't basic land types as well, but I don't think it's too difficult, right? Even if you're running Jund, if you run 4 Overgrown Tomb, 4 Blood Crypt, 4 Prismatic Vista, 2 Swamp, that's already 14 actual swamps in the deck, which, you know, should be enough to consistently have a swamp on turn 1 in the majority of games. So I don't think that part of the deck is going to be too difficult to set up, really, if that makes sense. I think the big drawback with this, though, is that it can't destroy black creatures, which I think if you think the metagame is largely going to be Eldrazi fast aggro fast combo, which I still think it probably is, then I think this is a fine card to run there, because it's going to be great against it's going to be a great card to run in that metagame, because it's going to be really good against all of the fast aggro and fast creature combo decks. But if the interactive decks do see play, if people persist with running Jund and, you know, Dimir Frog, even though those decks, in my opinion, just don't have a good matchup against Eldrazi no matter how you build them, or a consistently good matchup against Eldrazi at least, then you're going to struggle a little bit more, because it can't kill Barrogoyf, it can't kill Psychic Frog. I'm sure there are a couple of others that I'm not thinking about, but not being able to hit those is a bit of an issue. But, you know, having said that, if you are running a deck like Jund, you're likely going to have other pieces of interaction anyway. You're likely going to be running Fatal Push alongside this, so hopefully it's not a big issue there. And for the most part, having a piece of free interaction is going to be a really big deal. So yeah, I think out of all the cards from this set, this is the one that I've got my eye on to have the biggest impact. If you are going to persist with running a deck like Jund, or running, you know, Dimir Frog, or maybe Grixis Goyfs is something I've been testing recently to give access to Consign to Memory, this could be an interesting card to run in those sorts of decks. And like I've said, I don't think it's going to be too difficult to consistently have a swamp if you're willing to run Prismatic Vista, which most of these decks are anyway. The next up, we've got Titania, which is a pretty interesting one. You know, I've been testing a lot with Exploration plus Ice Till Explorer still recently. Now, the more I've tested with that package, the more I've realised that it just doesn't really feel consistent. Well, it doesn't really feel fast enough to me. And Titania is a card that could potentially fit in alongside that shell. But I think in Historic, the big drawback of this is that we just don't have enough. Well, we don't have a high enough density of good fetch lands to consistently use this, right? If it was whenever a land enters, then I think it would be a lot better. But the fact it's whenever a land leaves means you're very reliant on Prismatic Vista or maybe Ghost Quarter plus Ice Explorer to set this up. So I think this is an interesting card. Again, if you're running Green Sun Zenith or Call of Calling, it could be one to consider. But again, without having a high density of fetch lands, I think this is too difficult to trigger. And having a 5-drop that you're not going to consistently be able to trigger doesn't seem great to me. So I think without a lack of good fetch lands, this one probably isn't as good as it is in Modern. And even there, it doesn't really see too much play either. So the next up, we've got Torsten, founder of Benalia. Again, I think this is largely a cube card. However, this is a very powerful human to cheat into play off Winota. Now, obviously, Winota in Historic is still nerfed, so you can only get one card off it, but these are the sorts of cards, or these are the sorts of human payoffs that make nerfed Winota playable when you have individual humans that have such a big impact that you don't need multiple Winota triggers for it to be impactful. So I'm probably going to be testing out Winota with this card, but the classic issue with running Winota with a card like this is that it's just terrible to draw. So obviously that is going to have to be something you consider in terms of deck building, but if this does see Historic play, it's likely in a deck like that. But you know, Winota hasn't been good in Historic for so long now that I'm not super optimistic that's going to be good. So I imagine this probably won't see much play at all. The next one, we've got Tourach Dread Cantor, which is kind of interesting. Gives you another threat if you're running, you know, mono black or mainly mono black splashing another color. I have been testing a lot with Dauthi Voidwalker recently, and it does feel like those sorts of decks struggle for a high threat density that I want to be running, and Tourach could be interesting in those sorts of decks potentially. I think, you know, especially against Eldrazi, being able to go Dauthi and then force the opponent to discard their top end and then crack the Dauthi to cast stuff is pretty interesting. The issue I've had with those sorts of decks, though, is that I don't think Dauthi works particularly well with the Goyf cards, because you're exiling the opponent's graveyard, which limits the size the Goyfs grow to. But again, that's, you know, you could still potentially run them both together, and if you are after another 2-drop, this is another interesting one. And I do think if you're trying to run interaction, Dauthi plus discard spells is a good way to attack the Eldrazi deck, so this could be worth running there. But again, you could just run more discard spells instead. Although having said that, I do think one issue with Dauthi is that outside of Thoughtseize, the amount of discard spells in Historic that actually discard to the graveyard so you can use them with Dauthi's Void counters, and hit the expensive cards that you want to be able to hit is pretty low. I've been having to run Draconic Fealty alongside Thoughtseize, which doesn't feel great. So having a higher density of ways to force the opponent to discard that's just on a good, value seems pretty decent to me. So I think a shell with discard spells, Tourach, and Doithi could be an interesting way to build mid-range, but we'll see. I still think there's maybe a chance that the Goyf shell is just better as it is, and even there, I'm not sure that deck is very well positioned right now because it struggles, against Eldrazi for the most part. And then we've got Unexpectedly Absent, which is kind of an interesting removal spell. So the floor of this card is basically 2 mana, put any permanent on top of the opponent's library, which is, it's okay. The fact you need double white is a bit of a concern. And I also think that, again, we have much more efficient interaction. Fragment Reality is, obviously it gives them an extra creature, but it's just way more efficient at what it's doing, which I think the faster Historic has gotten recently, the more important efficiency is. So I feel like we probably have better options, and the double white is quite restrictive in what decks this can be run in, so I wouldn't be surprised if this one sees no play, just because I feel like we have better options in white already. So then we've got Unmarked Grave, which is a pretty interesting one. So this is obviously the first efficient way we've had of ditching creatures straight from the deck to the graveyard. Obviously, it can be used to ditch non-creatures as well, which I'll talk about in a second, but I imagine the first thing most people think of when they see this is it's just a way to set up a reanimation spell, right? If you're running Persist or Life Death, you can Unmarked Grave your best reanimation spell, then just Persist or Life Death it. But the issue with that is that I think the main reason to use Unmarked Grave over just looting effects is if you have one reanimation target that's just better than the rest. If there was like an Archon of Cruelty legal, for example, then you could obviously use Unmarked Grave to consistently get that in the graveyard. But in Historic, I don't really feel like there's one reanimation target that's that much better than the others, especially non-legendary ones. And also, whilst Surgical Extraction is still the most commonly played graveyard hate from what I've seen, I think running a reanimation deck where you only have one reanimation target is pretty risky. So the way I typically have built Reanimator in Historic recently is 2 reanimation targets, 4 of each, so you got 8 targets, and then you just run a bunch of looting effects, and with 8 you're fairly likely to find the first one early on. And I still think while Surgical Extraction is the most commonly played graveyard hate, you kind of have to do that, because if you just have one and they surgical it, your whole deck just stops working, basically. So I don't really see the appeal of running Unmarked Grave over 2 different reanimation targets and looting effects, because with Surgical still seeing play, you're going to get punished really easily if you just rely on Unmarked Grave, because it doesn't give you any other value, right? At least the looting effects will draw you into other cards. They'll find you lands if you need. They'll find you reanimation spells or targets if you need as well. The other thing that I'm kind of interested in with this card, though, is that it doesn't specify creatures. So there are other potential combo applications of this card. Maybe if you're running Shifting Woodland, you can use this to put, like, I don't know, I can't remember if Omniscience is legendary or not, but there will be some non-legendary non-creatures that you could potentially combo with this card as well. So that's the side of the card I think has more upside out of the 2. So if you think there is a card that, or specifically a combo that works really well with Unmarked Grave, definitely let me know in the comments, because that's the side of the card that I think I'm most excited about. I'm not really sure I'd want to run this in Reanimator right now anyway. Maybe if we get Archon of Cruelty in future, that could change though, and especially if Surgical Extraction sees less play, right? If Graveyard Hate in general sees less play, or people move towards another type of graveyard interaction, then maybe. But right now, I'm mainly excited for this for non-creatures. And then next up we got Upheaval, which I'm not really sure we have the tools to use very well in Historic. Again, I've not played with this card. I have seen it in, other people play it in Cube and all the formats a while ago, I think. And I believe the way this works is you have a bunch of really cheap fast mana that you can bounce the opponent's board, and then you can just replay all your fast mana again, like, the Moxen and stuff like that. If that is the way it works, I don't really see this thing play in Historic. Maybe the best case scenario I can think of is just running a deck with a bunch of acceleration with maybe exploration and stuff like that, and then you use Upheaval to just reset the board, and then you can rebuild more quickly because you have more ramp, but that doesn't seem very consistent or very good. It also seems quite slow to me, so I would be surprised if this sees play, unless I'm missing something. If there's an application that I am missing with this, definitely let me know in the comments, but I don't really see this one seeing play personally. The next time we got Vampire Hexmage, very iconic card. Really happy to get this one on Arena. Now, obviously, we don't have the most broken stuff you can do with this, like Dark Depths, but we do still have a couple of applications of this. First of all, is battles. Right, if you have a battle in play and you cast the Hexmage, you can remove all the counters, which will essentially flip it into the other side. Invasion of Alara is something that I know Aspiring Spike tested with shortly after that came out. Again, I don't really see that seeing play in Historic, but the one that could see play maybe is I can't remember the name of it because they're all invasion of something and I always forget which one it is, but there's one that tutors creatures, double green X, tutor a creature that costs X. So if you're running a deck that wants to be tutoring creatures as part of your proactive game plan, maybe if you're running a creature combo deck, then this seems really nice to just run in those sorts of decks as a one-off. So if you don't have a situation where you can set up your combo easily, you could just tutor the Hexmage, use the Hexmage to flip, to remove all the counters off the battle and just flip it straight away. And then secondly, this can also be used on the Overlord. Specifically, Overlord of the Baelmerk is going to be the best one, obviously, because it's in the colour combination. So you can go Overlord, potentially flip this over, and then similar to Dedicated Dollmaker, you could cast this, remove the counters from the Overlord, and then it can also attack the same turn. So it's even slightly better than Dedicated Dollmaker. However, the issue in that situation is that it just doesn't really do anything else in the deck, right? The great thing about Dollmaker alongside Overlord is that typically you're running creatures with ETBs, so if you're not using it to, bounce the Overlord into play, you can use it with your other ETB creatures and still get good use out of it. Whereas the Hexmage outside of the Overlord, I don't really see good uses for it. So, maybe you could run it in a deck with that and the green battle, but then again, I guess you could, that makes sense, right? You could run a green-black base creature combo deck with both of them together. That's probably the home I could see most, but again, that deck doesn't really exist at the moment, so I'm not really sure it will see play, but definitely one to bear in mind going forwards. And I'm sure, as we get more cards added to the format, there will be other cards that interact very well with the Hexmage. So again, don't think it has a great home right now, but definitely one to bear in mind going forward. The next up we got Winds of Abandon, which is basically, I guess it's essentially, a more expensive sorcery speed path to exile that you can overload to essentially sweep the whole board. But again, I think as Historic gets faster, efficiency becomes more important, and this is just kind of inefficient at everything, really. So I think we've got better options. I would be surprised if this one sees play, personally. The next one we got Woodfall Primus, which, if this does see play, it's going to be cheating it into play. It is a non-legendary creature, so it does work with Persist and stuff like that, but I don't know, I don't see this as better than a card like Ashen Rider, which can also target creatures, and even then Ashen Rider has felt a little bit subpar in certain matchups as well, so I would be surprised if this sees play over other options that we've already got, and those options aren't really that great compared to stuff like Archon of Cruelty anyway, so I'd be surprised if this one sees play. And then finally, Zuran Orb. Again, this feels like one where I'm probably missing something. I'm sure there is probably some kind of broken interaction with Zuran Orb that I'm not aware of. I mean, maybe if you're running Titania, this is kind of interesting, but again, having to run two cards that don't really do much on their own. Obviously, Titania does if you've got Prismatic Vista, but yeah, you don't want to run two bad cards to make both of them good, if that makes sense. It is another 0-mana artifact for affinity, so I don't know if you value this more than Tormod's Crypt in the main deck. But this, out of all the cards, this definitely feels like the one where I wouldn't be surprised if there's some kind of broken interaction with Zuran Orb in Historic that I'm not aware of, but I can't really think of it off the top of my head. So definitely, again, let me know in the comments if you think there is some sort of interaction with this that I'm missing out on. But for the most part, outside of Affinity just wanting to run more 0-mana artifacts to pair with Pinnacle Emissary or make Emery 1 mana more consistently, and you value the incidental life gain over the Graveyard Hate, which I think is wrong at the moment. I think, especially if you are running Affinity, Tormod's Crypt is generally much more useful because I think one of the biggest ways you lose against the Eldrazi decks is if they can exile Ugin's Binding from the graveyard to, reset your entire board. So having Tormod's Crypt does feel more valuable to me in that shell at the least. So I feel like if this does see play, it's likely going to be in like a dedicated combo deck where being able to sacrifice lands for free is part of the part of the combo in the deck. So again, let me know in the comments if you can think of something with that. But those are all the cards. Like I said, I'm not sure these are going to have a massive impact in the format, which, to be honest, I think is probably a good thing if they do make this legal for the qualifier. Again, my understanding is they haven't clarified yet, and personally, I would prefer them to hold off, just because the 4 days that, you know, these cards will be legal are during a weekday when I'm sure many people won't have much time to practice. So I would personally prefer them to hold off. But if they do end up allowing these cards to be legal, I think the main ones you want to be aware of, Dress Down maybe, but again, I don't think that really has too many applications right now. Like I said, Leovold, if you're running Chord of Calling or Green Sun Zenith, definitely seems worth considering. Snuff Out, you know, again, if you can make this work with your mana base and consistently have swamps, you know, I think you basically want to aim for 18 actual swamps. 14 actual swamps in your deck to consistently have it on turn 1, which I think you want for the most part, right? You would love to be able to go, you know, turn 1 Thoughtseize, opponent plays a creature and you can just kill it on turn 1 and still not have to use any of your mana. That seems really good. So Snuff Out, I think, is likely to be the main one that does see play out of these, if any of them do. You know, Tourach maybe, if you want to go hard on the Dauthi plus discard plan, could be a potential one to run there. And obviously protection from white can be useful against decks like Boros Auras potentially as well. And then outside of that, I'm not really sure there's too many of these are going to fit into the current metagame. But if, you know, they do end up hitting Eldrazi Temple after the qualifier, or, you know, fingers crossed, maybe they'll do it before. I mean, if they're willing to add a set 4 days before the qualifier, maybe there's a chance. But I mean, again, if they do shake things up before a qualifier or an event, I think, you know, a couple weeks is usually the minimum, I would say. So not 100% sure about that. But either way, if Eldrazi Temple does end up getting banned, I think the format does open up a lot more. And then maybe decks, you know, if there's a combo deck that relies on a 5-drop, Pentad Prism could be an exciting option there. And then I think just in general, more of these cards are likely to see play. Definitely let me know in the comments what you think, if there are any applications of these cards that I didn't talk about, or any brews that you've got in mind with these cards. Definitely let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear that. Either way, hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll catch you on the next one. Big up.